Welcome, everyone. We know we can see from the registration that we've got quite a lot of overseas women as well as UK women with us tonight. So good morning or good afternoon, whatever time of day it is where you are. It's fantastic to be able to make these connections. This is our third Women's Place webinar. We had one on feminist filmmaking and one on the law, and as you know, tonight we're talking about men's violence against women. We're going to be recording the session and it will be uploaded on the Women's Place website as soon as we can. There'll be a little delay because we're going to have subtitles when it goes up, and when we've tested the subtitles to everybody, when we've tested the subtitles, they weren't able to keep track of a conversation like the one we're having in a live sort of feed, so it's going to take some editing before we can get those on there. We've got me and three fantastic women here tonight. It's an absolute honour to be participant and chair of this meeting. I'm going to start by introducing everybody. You won't probably see the screen in the same order as me. So we have Joan Smith. Joan is author of Misogynies, and that was first published in 1989. I'm not sure how many times it's been published since, but I know it's several. She's an English journalist, novelist, and human rights activist. She's former chair of Writers in Prison Committee, the Writers in Prison Committee. Joan's been chair of the Mayor of London's Violence Against Women and Girls Board since 2013. We haven't had a mayor that long, have we? But she's here tonight in an independent capacity, not with that hat on. Her latest book, Homegrown: How Domestic Violence Turns Men into Terrorists, was it published last year or the last year? Last year. And it's been shortlisted this year for the Neve Memorial Prize. We've also got Pragna Patel. Pragna's a founding member of Southall Black Sisters, which is a service provision and advocacy and campaigning centre. She worked as coordinator and senior caseworker at SBS from 1982 to 93, when she disappeared from that role for a little while and trained as a solicitor. I didn't know she'd done that. I must have been out of London for that for that amount of time. So when I've met up again with her recently, I've been quite intimidated by how well she knows the law. So I'm glad that jigsaw piece has fallen.
Don't ask me legal questions.
No, my God, she's good. I mean, I know you're good anyway. Pragna's been centrally involved in some of SBS's most important cases and campaigns around domestic violence, immigration, and religious fundamentalism. She's also written extensively on race, gender, and religion. Our third panel is Afsana Lashaw. Afsana is a women's rights activist and political commentator. She advocates on issues relating to women and sexual violence, freedom of expression, and legal justice. Last year, she was joint winner of the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize. Afsana's been fighting an 8-year multi-jurisdictional battle to be reunited with her son. Afsana, is it Louis or Louis? Louis. Louis, I thought it would be. Who was removed from the Sharia divorce court when he was just 3 years old. Now, there's more about Afsana's case on our Eventbrite, but I know Afsana will be talking about this tonight, so I don't want to go into that too much, because I think it's much better to hear it from Afsana herself. I'm Karen Ingalla Smith. I'm CEO of a women's organisation called NIA. I've been there 10 years. We provide domestic and sexual violence services, including to women in prostitution across East London. I am founder of the Counting Dead Women, and that has evolved into a project called the Femicide Census, which I'm co-founder and director with Clary O'Callaghan. So we wanted to have a conversation about men's violence against women tonight, but I also think it'd be a really great opportunity to get to know these fab women on the panel as women and human beings as well, not just as talking heads. So some of the things that we're talking about will be a little bit more personal and about how we got involved in the sort of work and campaigning that we do. I thought I'd start by asking the panelists who were their biggest influences in terms of their work and their understanding of men's violence against women, but I decided I'm going to take chair's liberty here and kick off a bit from my perspective first, and I think for me, having Pragna and Joan on this panel is really such an honour. Southall Black Sisters, together with Justice for Women, introduced me to that combination of activism and doing the work with women, if you like. I first started working with homeless women in 1990 and joined what was Westminster Women's Aid in 1992. We used to get this little 6-weekly or bi-monthly magazine sent by post, because of course we had no internet back then, from National Women's Aid, and every now and again it'd have a little interesting flyer in it. And there must have been a flyer to a demo that SBS and Justice for Women were running around the case of Karanjit Ahluwalia, who was taking an appeal to she'd been in prison for murdering her husband, and she was running an appeal to get that convicted to a manslaughter charge. I think I'll let Pragna tell you more about that, but that was my first taste of a feminist demo, turning up and standing outside. I guess it wouldn't have been the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, and I came to some community hall way out in West London, God knows where. So I really want to thank you for, I guess, really early on showing how you could blend activism and service provision, and SBS continue to be an inspiration in that way as a service provider. And for me, and the way that we run NIA, really, you absolutely are an inspiration as an organisation. Joan, we mentioned your book Misogynies, which I think was published in 1989 first, and I'm not sure when I first read it, but it was one of the first feminist non-fiction books that I'd ever read that wasn't a textbook, if you see what I mean. So it wasn't a sociology book. It was putting the concepts that I'd learned about into practice. So seeing your analysis out of how the Peter Sutcliffe case was handled by Yorkshire Police, and it just made all those concepts real for me. And also you wrote it in a really accessible way, which I think is so important, because not all feminist texts are accessible, and I think that was an incredible thing to do. And as you know, I've read Homegrown as well, and I think you've continued like that, and I guess that's partly your journalistic training, but you know, you really helped place things in my mind, really, that I could see around me but didn't have the language to place in that sort of a framework. And then Afsana, I've crossed paths with you more recently, I think actually probably introduced by Pragna in your appeal, and then last year when you were joint winner of Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize. And I just want to say you're an absolute inspiration in terms of your courage and tenacity. There's no enemy too big for you, and you know, you're a tiny little thing, but you've taken, obviously your battle's still ongoing, but thank you for what you're doing, and you are such an inspiration to me and many. So from that, I'm going to move to our panelists and ask them to tell us about big influences on their work and their understanding of men's violence against women. And shall we go to you first, Pragna?
Well, first of all, Karen, can I say, you know, risk of this becoming like a mutual appreciation society, I just want to just acknowledge your contribution in the work on violence against women and girls. It's massive. And your founding of Counting Dead Women and then turning femicide, such a simple, clear idea, but I wish I thought of it. You know, it is just an amazing now database from which, you know, so many different things can be, we can draw on it for so many different campaigns and things. So equally, you know, I just think that you're inspirational as much as my other fellow panelists for me. And I suppose my starting point to answer your question about who's influenced me is I can't single out any one person. I just cannot. What I feel more and more is the privilege to be coming after so many amazing women and to be building on the work of so many amazing women. None of us on our own hold power and knowledge. And it's only when we, you know, put our knowledge together that we get some idea of the enormity of what we're facing. So for me, the way in which women who've come before me in all fields, not just in the feminist field, I have to say, and not just women either, but the way in which activists, academics have understood and also acted upon the social injustices that they face, that we face. And for me, as a young person out of school, out of college, I wanted to set up I wanted to be part of an organization that I could also call my political home. Important to me, it was like bringing the person and the public and the political together was very, very important to me, because as someone growing up, having faced sexism, having faced racism, having been almost forced into a marriage and so on, it was so important to find a way of understanding those formative experiences and the politics around me, the feminist politics, the anti-racist, the struggles by lawyers to set up law centers. You know, these were all inspirational moments for me particularly. And so I feel that I can't single anyone out. And I feel that I've drawn upon so many different disciplines, so many different influences, because, you know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the work around male violence against women has also benefited from the work that people have done on human rights, the work people have done in relation to other movements, for, you know, other social inequalities. And for me, these are really, really important things that I've drawn upon even to understand, you know, my particular area, which is violence against women and girls, particularly in Black and minority communities. So I feel that it wouldn't be right to single any one person out. It's just a roll call, but each and every one have been important in different ways. And that for me is the strength of the women's movement itself, is that we bring different perspectives, we bring different experiences and analysis, and find a way of weaving them all together in this kind of political tapestry.
Thanks. What about you, Afsana? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just want to say again, echo what Pragna's saying. But I think firstly, it's really important for us to have space. And I think sort of, you know, huge thanks to Women's Place UK for giving all of us a safe space where we can actually discuss these matters, because it's really important now where voices are being shut down and women are being silenced in so many ways. And I'll talk about my case a little bit later. But in terms of what inspires me or how I got into activism, so like yourself, Karen, I started, I'm going to be revealing my age now. So I started in the early 90s, and I remember going on the battle lines on the campaign for Kiranjit Ahluwalia's thread, and again being drawn into SBS, because at that time there was no one else that, there were grassroots campaigns, but they meant different things to different people. Coming from an Asian cultural background, our voices and our experiences weren't in the mainstream. So my early work, I started in local authority. So I worked in Newham and Tower Hamlets. And for me, what got me into activism and looking at tackling male violence, and particularly domestic violence, is in the early 90s, we had quite a dangerous situation, particularly for a lot of Asian women. I was working in the local authority at that time, particularly in places like Newham. There was FGM. There were not so much, I can't remember honour killings, but certainly a lot of young women being taken away, abducted, let's call it that, by their families, and then being forced marriages, which years later, and those are the things that I worked on in the early 90s, right up until the 2000s actually. So I'd already been doing that professionally as well as personally. So when you say what inspired you and what who I admire, I think it's about all those women that are unsung heroes who are trying to fight in their homes, trying to protect themselves, trying to protect their children. I'm sure many women have joined this conversation. We all have our battles. So for me, it's a collective battle. So there are many women that we will never know the name of. All the women that you're counting in your particular research, Karen, those are all heroes, sheroes, women who have overcome adversity. We don't get to read about them all the time. And too often we read about it when it's too late. And so my thing is that I've been inspired by those women who we don't see, we don't read about, we don't hear. And every day they're fighting and tackling male violence to protect themselves and to protect other women.
Thank you. I think that's really important to honour those women. I think very similar. I remember loads of women that I worked with as a practitioner, and also the women that I guess work in the organisations. So that Pragna and I work in women who are rocking up to work every day and dealing with caseloads and of stories of horrific violence and processing that and supporting women and then living their lives. It is an honour to do this sort of work, isn't it? Joan, what about you? Are you gonna keep it general as well? Are you gonna name some?
Well, I don't remember a time when I wasn't a feminist. I mean, I remember being a feminist from about 8 years old, and I think there was an element of class in this because I come from a northern working class family and I'm an only child. And my father very much brought me up to say, even though you're a girl, even though you're working class, you can do absolutely anything. And I just thought, oh, right. And went off into this world where people were always telling me I couldn't do things because I was a girl and because I was a woman, both at school and university, and when I started work as a journalist. So I was looking around for explanations for this behaviour. So I just read voraciously. So I read Germaine Greer, of course, and Germaine has written a lot since that I don't agree with, but I still think that the Female Eunuch is an important book. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, I absolutely loved. I think that had a huge, huge influence on me. Viraga published a book by Amrit Wilson, which I think was an incredibly important milestone in the women's movement in this country. Trying to give Asian women a voice that the wider community could hear. But I was also very interested in women in history. So Mary Wollstonecraft was an inspiration, and a woman called Olympe de Gouges. And during the French Revolution, which I always thought was a kind of pretty male sort of movement, and they published a Declaration of the Rights of Man, and they really did mean the rights of man. They didn't mean the rights of people or the rights of women. So Olympe de Gouges, who is a working class woman from central France, came from a very small village, came to Paris, reinvented herself as a playwright, and she wrote a sort of semi-satirical Declaration of the Rights of Women. And she was guillotined. She died on the scaffold. And so I've always been aware that, that other women have paid a huge price for even starting this movement. And so it's very, very moving to know that you're following in their footsteps and that there are other women around you who are doing things and actually taking quite big risks.
Funny how you mentioned class has been part of what pivoted you into being a feminist. 'Cause I'd say it was class that mean I hadn't even heard of feminism until I did A-level sociology. And then when I heard about this thing called feminism, I thought it was a stupid idea. How could I possibly have more in common with women? And I went to an A-level college. How the posh girls there than the lads on my street. You know, I'd been sort of sold on class consciousness before. I was sold on sex class consciousness, and it took me a little while to put it together that you could be both. Yes. So I mean, that also brings me to another question in terms of all of us looking back to the child that we were, and how as a girl we might have, what were the influences in our homes and in our lives that set us into, I suppose, turned us all into feminists with a special interest in men's violence against women. So for myself, there was violence in my family. The guy who I thought was my dad was violent to us kids, my mum and the family dog. And it's funny, I realised I felt sadder about the dog than I felt sadder about the child that I was, and that I was no less innocent than the dog was, really. And I think that took some processing. And I saw violence in friends' early relationships, and I was growing up in Yorkshire when Peter Sutcliffe was attacking women, and just after the Moors murderers had been abducting and murdering children. And I think all those influences, although I wasn't sort of conscious of them being part of my developing psyche, I think they sort of pushed me to I suppose where I am, and because my mum is a working class woman, I guess the class stuff and the keeping ordinary and not pitching up there all the time, if you like, is really important to me. And I wondered what the stories of you three were. And Joan, also in yours, so you're working class northerner, you were working for the Times. How did that happen?
Well, I come from a family which is miners on one side and merchant seamen on the other. And but my father, who was actually a council gardener, he moved to London before I was born. So I was always the strange one in the family, you know, that I didn't have the Geordie accent like the rest of my family and so on. And my father was very, very aspirational. And I mean, I had quite an unusual upbringing in that sense, because when I was about 11, my father gave me a copy of the Communist Manifesto, and he said, I don't agree with this, but it's influenced a lot of people and you should know about it. So I went to school imagining that everybody was reading books like this, and quickly discovered that they weren't. But I think that's sometimes the influence of fathers is the good influence of fathers is not always acknowledged, and that was a big influence on me. But of course, then one of my first job was on a paper in Blackpool, and I did that for a couple of years, and then I got the job in Manchester on a local radio station, and I found myself pitched into the serial killings, the Sutcliffe killings, and I think I've just never had any deference, and I was being sent to these awful press conferences after different murders, and being faced with a row of cops who seemed to me completely incompetent, and not just incompetent but misogynist, and the assumptions they made about women, particularly the working class women, because later on in the series, of course, Peter Sutcliffe started attacking women outside red light areas, and the police themselves kind of characterized that as mistakes. And that was so profoundly shocking. And I did argue with them. There was a press conference when they played the tape for the first time, and I was the only woman there, and we all listened to the tape. And on the way in, they'd had a stunt where they'd called in the local prostituted women first and played them the tape to warn them in case they hadn't noticed that there was this killer out there. And when I walked in, the head of the Ripper Squad looked at me and said, "Sorry, love, you're too late. The prose conference is over." Because, of course, any woman who was there could only be a prostituted woman. You know, there wasn't any other role for women. And I was the only woman, and they played the tape, and I put my hand up. and said, have you edited that tape? And the cop said no. And I said, there is nothing on that tape that isn't in the public domain. There's no evidence at all that he's from the Northeast. And the actual, you know, the surviving witnesses actually say he had a Yorkshire accent. And of course, they went herring off after this figment of their imagination. And it was profoundly shocking. I mean, that was my introduction to you know, thinking and writing about violence against women. And when I went to work for the Sunday Times, I said, you know, I was working on the Insight team doing investigative journalism. And I said, you know, we really have to look at this because I think I know the mistakes they're making. And of course, we were right. And when we published an analysis of the mess they were making of the case, the police called me up and came round to the Sunday Times and said I commissioned offence under the Official Secrets Act and they were going to arrest me. And the editor in those days, Harry Evans, was terrific. And he said, if you arrest Joan, who's one of the few women journalists working on this case, and you're so incompetent and haven't been able to protect women from this man, we'll put it on the front page of the paper every week. And so they backed down. But it was profoundly shocking. And for years afterwards, I had terrible nightmares about it because I interviewed 3 of the surviving victims, and it just haunted me. I had nightmares for years, and I thought I would write it after I left the Sunday Times. I thought I might write a book about that case. But then I thought, no, it belongs in a larger conversation. And I began to notice all these things, like, do you remember when Saturday Night Fever came out? And there was this song, I mean, I love Saturday Night Fever, except there was this song called More Than a Woman. And it drove me mad because all my friends were singing along to it. And it's you're more than a woman to me. And I'm thinking, like, what? You're sort of like as good as their dog or something, you know? And I thought, this is all over the place. And so I just thought, I'll sit down and see if I can do it. And I couldn't bear it. I mean, it took me 6 months to write, but only because, you know, I think there's a limit to how long you can stand that sort of material. And the same thing happened even more when I wrote the book about domestic violence and terrorism.
Thank you. Pragna, what about little Pragna? You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Okay, so my earliest memory, believe it or not, is a memory of an act of seeing a man attempting to kill a woman. I was probably about 3 years old, and I was born in Kenya, so I was living in Kenya. I still have this vivid memory. Of course, I didn't know at the time that what I was witnessing was an act of male violence. But at the age of 3, I remember a commotion taking place on the street outside, or a huge crowd of Asian. In Kenya, there was a very large Asian community, Indian community, and there was a big commotion outside, and I ran outside to see what was going on. The crowd had gathered. There was a big crowd of men and women, largely Asian. And in the middle of the crowd was a man, an Asian man, holding a machete in one hand, and on the other hand, a woman that I later realized was his wife. And this was a public display, an absolutely public performance going on, where I can't remember now what he was saying, but all I remember is he was holding the machete over her. She was pleading and squirming and trying to get away from his grip, and she was on the floor. I remember it terrified me as a 3-year-old. And I remember hiding behind these women's saris, but peeping every now and again to see what was going on. And nobody ever explained to me what had happened. And so as I grew up, the memory kind of recedes, and then it just came flooding back to me just from nowhere. And I kind of understood then that what I had experienced and what I had witnessed was not only an individual act of violence against a woman, but an act of violence in which the entire community was complicit. And that really, you know, it remains with me, and it remains with me because I think we don't, you know, the focus on the complicity side of violence that's committed by men, but not just men, you know, multiple perpetrators in the case of Asian families. and including women sometimes, and the complicity, the kind of the social, the religious, the cultural norms that enable that complicity and so on. So that's probably my earliest memory, although I would not say that that influenced me in the direction that I was eventually to go in. As I was growing up, gender inequality was all around me. I came from also a working class family. My father was a baggage handler at Heathrow Airport. My mother worked in factories. My mother was a very strong woman. She had to be, to cope with the kind of racism that she faced, plus work in factories, plus bring up 5 children. And at that time, she was quite a feisty person, because in the workplace, the conditions were really poor if you came from, you know, BME backgrounds, particularly if you were women. And she fought battles every day in the workplace to fight for better working conditions for women like her. She was the generation of women that fought like tigers, like Jaya Ben Desai, the Grunwicks striker, who led that very famous struggle for workplace rights for Asian women, for women generally. So she was of that generation. So, you know, obviously I was influenced by her strength, by her tenacity, but also absolutely influenced by the structural nature of inequality. The fact that when we had family gatherings, men would be in one room and women would be in another. Women would be cooking while men talked politics, although it fascinated me that the political conversations fascinated me and the cooking absolutely bored me. But I would get into trouble for sneaking out and listening to the conversations that the men were holding. And then obviously when I finished university and came back to Southall, which is where my family were located, and joined Southall Black Sisters and set up the advocacy center, I still really didn't have a sense that the focus of Southall Black Sisters was going to be violence against women. I had a sense that we wanted to have an advice advocacy center, that we wanted to kind of model ourselves on the law center movements. In other words, to talk about women's rights, not women's traditional activities, not set up sewing classes, not set up cookery classes, but actually have a center that actually mobilized around women's rights. But we had no idea that when women started coming to us from the early 80s, that they would present with issues of gender-based violence. It could have been anything, and that could have led us in a different direction. It could have been employment rights. It could have been housing and homelessness. And of course, these are all implicated in women's experiences of gender-based violence. But nevertheless, very, very quickly, as soon as we set up, the one issue that all the women came to us with was experiences and accounts of gender-based violence. And very early on, we took up campaigns and supported particularly Asian women who, as Joan said, had no voice, had no public presence in terms of society. And we very, very early on took up campaigns. So for example, we campaigned for justice around the case of a woman called Rubina Akram, who came from Oxford. And there was a local women's group campaigning for her, and we linked up with that campaign. She was a woman whose husband had almost killed, but had taken an axe to her and almost killed her, and she was left disfigured for life. And she was fighting for justice because the criminal justice system at that time didn't take any of that seriously. We linked up with Birmingham Black Sisters, who were campaigning for a woman called Iqbal Begum, the first case that I ever came across of a battered woman who'd killed her husband, but who had the shortest trial in criminal justice history in this country, 15 minutes. And she was convicted for his murder. And obviously the violence was not taken into account, but hers was a real miscarriage of justice because they provided the wrong interpretation for her. And at her trial, she was asked if she pleaded guilty or not guilty, and she thought they were asking her whether it was galti or not galti, and galti in Urdu means mistake. So she said galti, thinking she was saying that she'd made a mistake, which was taken to mean she was guilty and imprisoned for life. And it was Birmingham Black Sisters who really who campaigned for her freedom, and eventually she was freed after 3 years of imprisonment. And we also linked up with our own case at that time in Southall, which was a case of a woman called Krishna Sharma, who had hung herself after years of violence. So here was a situation where we were looking at how women internalize abuse and violence. And that had a profound influence on me in terms of how the state, and in particular the inquest system, fails to look at that backstory, that narrative of violence when women commit suicide, and how the perpetrators go absolutely free, even though they've driven women to suicide. It's still a problem now. So these were some of the early influences that kind of forced us in the direction of working on, male violence and domestic violence and all forms of gender-related violence.
It's incredible, really, isn't it, that 25, 30 years later, we're still, suicide in women who've experienced men's violence against women is being treated almost as an emerging issue, and we're still seeing women dealing with miscarriage of justice when they've been a victim of violence and they've killed the man that's abusing them for years. It's tragic, really, that we've been doing this for so long and we're fighting the same battles. I'm going to move on to Afsana now. And Afsana, if we can start with looking at you before you were working at Newham, and then I think it might be good then to move into your case and tell us about your campaign. Looks like Afsana's frozen for a moment. Oh,
yeah. Sorry, you're back. I missed all that.
So I was wondering if you could tell us about your earlier life, really, but then move that into your crowdfunding campaign and your very long legal battle, and I think it'd be a good opportunity to hear what you're doing here. Yeah,
thank you. So I'll try and be, because of time, and I know there's questions as well. In comparison to everyone, I come from a very conservative family, and back to Joan's reference, my father was quite a traditional Asian Muslim man who actually really believed that girls should achieve as much as boys should. And, I have 2 other sisters, we're all very close. So I think you're surrounded by inequality. So as an Asian woman growing up, it was always, you have to be a doctor or a lawyer or, something like that. And if you wanted to work for a charity, that was frowned upon. That was because, we're measured by our money and the university we went to. So it's a very very status-ridden sort of environment, society. And as everyone said, you were surrounded by inequality. So I think, in that sense, I think fathers and men have very, very important role models and influences, because your early influence is obviously the people that raise you. And that has an also important impact on what I'm going to speak about my own case. But I'd like to share something that got me into activism was actually my early 20s. So I'd always been quite sort of, active, I would say, for women's rights from a very early age. And one of the first things I did was I actually volunteered to work for a women's organisation and for a refuge. And one of the things in those days, there weren't that many spaces around. So you could do crazy things like, if someone wanted help, you could give them a room and you could help them. And, there weren't any of these safeguarding rules and regulations around. And I remember that during the course of the work that I was doing, I came across a woman who was violently assaulted, and she was seeking refuge in a place. And I had to transport her, or help her, basically go from one place, pack her things from where she was and go to another place. And her husband was stalking her, and I was on a train station, and he was also following me, which I didn't know about at the time. This is all very my late teens, early 20s. And then he came up and said, I know you've moved her, basically harassing, interrogating me to find out where she was. And I was quite bolshy then, that's difficult to put it. And so I was being very brave and, you know, saying to him that there's just no way I'm going to tell him, and basically to go and, you know, jump in the lake somewhere. And then he just turned around and punched me in the face. And then I always remember I ended up with a broken nose, and my nose here has always had a ridge, because from the time years ago, decades ago, where he assaulted me because I wasn't revealing where his wife was. And I mean, obviously, I reported it to the police. The police were absolutely not very helpful in those days. I mean, we're talking about late 90s, early 2000s. So I told his wife what happened. She felt mortified. And in a way, I was saying to her, he's so violent that you cannot go back to him. Because again, I'm sure that every one of us knows, most women you come across at that time, I don't know about now if it's that prevalent, but most women I'd met through the course of my activism and work always ended up going back. I mean, it was just impossible. And she actually did end up going back to him. I don't know what happened afterwards. I had naively thought that the act that he had done, I mean, that my nose is nothing, but I can imagine for her to have fled and then to be in that violent situation. So that really had quite a profound impact on me, and that's why I ended up working for, particularly in the local authority, to try and develop domestic services for women who are fleeing domestic violence. And that was pretty much what I did for a decade. And I came across New Asian Women's Group, I came across Southall Black Sisters, I came across a whole range of other groups. So just to fast forward that to now, I think most people who aren't familiar with my case, I'll just give you a quick synopsis. So I found myself in 2011 in a situation where my marriage had broken down. I was in Dubai. My ex-husband is French, and I'd gone to settle with him. I'd had sorry, there's a mosquito flying around. I was in a situation where our relationship had broken down in a foreign country, and I found myself locked out of our family home in an Islamic country where there are very little rights for women with a 12-month-old baby to look after. So I was destitute, and in that country there are no support systems because the law, there's no law on domestic violence. In fact, there's a law that says men are allowed to violate women, providing there's no marks, and this is Dubai law. So there are no laws, there are no safeguards for women who find themselves in a situation where, you know, for whatever reason, they can't be living in that relationship. So I sought the advice of the British Embassy in Dubai. They couldn't help me. In fact, they were pretty, I know this is public, pretty useless in protecting citizens and protecting women. There are no safeguarding for women who are in a situation where they find themselves trapped for whatever reason. And for pretty much 3 years, I was living homeless on floors with a 12-month-old baby with no money. My passport was taken off me. I was being arrested several times. I mean, there's a lot of newspaper links on my story. So fast forward that, I found myself divorced in a Dubai court by my ex-husband. He'd gone to the Dubai court and obtained a divorce. And within the divorce, there was an order for my son, my then 3-year-old son, Louis, to be removed from my care. So he was removed, and there was very little that I could do about that. I fought in Dubai to get him back, to see him. I wasn't allowed any contact. So basically my legal battle since coming back to this country, I got back in 2014, and pretty much I've been trying to get the British courts to not overturn, I've been trying to just be reunited with my son. He was taken when he was 3. I had no contact with him. And if I'd left it to Dubai law, under their Sharia law, I wouldn't have seen Louis until he was 18. So that was a very, very painful prospect for me. And so I started campaigning. And then in 1997, it got to the High Court, my case. So all I wanted was, I wanted to have a relationship with my son and my son to have a relationship with me. I knew that there's no way I would get Louis back, but I just wanted to be able to speak to him. I mean, I didn't know if Louis was alive then, and he wouldn't have known if I was alive. And then I found myself in this awful situation, and there's more details on the crowdfunder, but I will just summarize what was said in court, where a British court said basically that pretty much, I mean, I'm going to sort of quote some of the judge's comments, he didn't believe that I had been, you know, a victim of abuse because I didn't look like a victim. And there were various references in the court case that I was sophisticated, that I was intelligent, I should have known better. So, you know, what, intelligent women never aren't in coercive control relationships. So there was all that said about me, which, you know, the judge, it's his court, he looks at evidence. So he never took account of the fact that I was kicked out of the house. He did say that, yes, I know that's happened, and yes, you were thrown out on the streets, and yes, you were destitute, but actually that doesn't really matter, because you, at the end of the day, well, in his words, I deserved what I got. And he actually did say that had I been in England, he would have had me arrested. And I'm quoting it, and he would have done exactly the same thing. So the fact that my son was taken away on a divorce which said I was a neglectful mother and I hadn't obeyed him. So Dubai's laws, you can get divorced if you disobey your husband. And that was all said in the British court. And the judge said, that's fine. That's a divorce from a friendly nation. And their laws are the same as ours. This is all in the judgment. So I'm not saying anything that isn't in the judgment. The only problem with that is that in France, on the same set of facts, the French court, and again, this is all on my crowdfunder and my website, said that the Dubai divorce was manifestly discriminatory. It was invalid. They chucked the whole thing out, and because they've said that Dubai treats women as second-class citizens. So I'm left with this situation where the French have chucked it out and said, we're not having this. They said it's a breach of their public policy because men and women are equal before the law. And then you've got a British judge here that says, I don't care what the French said. I actually like the fact that Dubai did this divorce. It was all proper and it's from a friendly nation and their laws are the same as ours. Now, my question would be to anyone, by any stretch of the imagination, you know, you have the UN, you have the European Commission and others have done reports on the UAE's legal system. And then you have also the French court saying this is actually not right. So how is it, and I'm not laughing about it because it's very painful for me. I not only lost the case, so the judge chucked it out, I've got 6 hours with my son every year. I get to see him in a centre. I mean, even a criminal gets more. I'm supervised. I have to sit in a tiny room and see Louis twice a year for 3 hours each time. And that's what I have to live with. And then to pile on more injustice, and this is, I hope we can have this open conversation. I know that there'll be many questions after, is that not only did I lose, which was, you know, I can accept that I lost, but then to say that I've got to pay nearly £100,000 for my ex-husband because I fought to see my son. It's so rare in children's cases to be penalised like that. I mean, normally, I'm not going to get legalistic in here, but I think all of you know who work in this arena, it's very rare for you to end up with such a huge financial penalty. All I'm doing is I'm trying to get not justice, I'm just trying to have a relationship with my son. How can you, as a British judge, it's unconscionable to actually punish me. And then just today, you know, I've had letters from the court, I've been summoned for an order to be questioned. Questions on what? So on top of that, and I'm going to end it there, when he did the cost order, I've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder because I'd been imprisoned, I'd been detained, I'd been separated from my child. I find it quite upsetting to talk about it, so I'm going to really rush because I know it's time. I can't, my life every day is a living hell. It's nice to be able to talk about it in this way, but I find it very difficult to function every day. I put on a face like everyone does because I have to survive. I can't begin to tell you what has been happening to me in the last 2 weeks, because all that, the court process that has kicked in because of this judge has meant that I can be homeless in a matter of weeks because I can't pay this bill. The judge had a discretion. He used his discretion. Didn't have to. The law didn't require him to do that. So now I've had not enough. I'm not only is my mental health suffering and I'm living my life on the edge. It's a very fine line between suicide and depression. And I would say, very quite honestly, I'm talking about my mental health now, is these people are crushing me and driving me to the edge. So I'm trying to speak out against what is happening, but also for other women. Yes, I was called sophisticated and articulate. And yes, I am articulate because I was privileged enough as an Asian woman to be educated by my father, who worked bloody damn well hard, because the way the system treats women and the way the system treats ethnic minority women, we're treated like the lowest of the low. I'm finding that now. And so if there's an articulate woman, and as an Asian woman, this is happening to me, and I have the support. SBS, Pragna's been in my case. So don't even ask me, ask Pragna. She's witnessed it. What hope is there for anyone else? It's a warning to women. Don't take your case to court, particularly not in the British court, because you know what? You will end up not only losing your child, losing your life, but losing your home as well.
It's difficult to know what to say in response to that, and there's nothing I can say to make it better. So I would urge people, if you're watching, if you can support Afsana's crowdfunding campaign to help address at least this one issue of the many injustices that she's faced. We'd all be very grateful.
You know, Karen, can I just come in here?
Oh, please.
Kind of reflect on some of the stuff Afsana has said and also what she's gone through. I mean, Afsana, just incredibly strong. You're incredibly strong. And I don't know, you know, that strength of yours, we can only, by being here, by validating what you're saying and by witnessing what you're going through, is to just give you more strength to carry on, really. But I do think it raises some really, really, I mean, there's so many questions of Sana's cases raises for me. There is the issue of what is the law there for? Who is the law for? Is the law a site for feminist resistance? Is it a subversive site? Or is it also a place where women can be done over, as Afsana? You know, how much we cannot put all our faith in the legal basket, and I know that that includes all of us who use the law all the time in every shape and form to get women justice on a daily basis, to try and get the remedies they need, the protection they need. But the law is part of the power. It's a site of power. It's a site of patriarchy. It's a site of racial and economic power. And so, you know, dealing with all of that in such a contradictory way is so important. On the one hand, feminists have done so much to shed light on violence against women or gender-related violence as a human rights concern, as a human rights matter, as a even reconceptualizing violence against women as an aspect of torture or terrorism in the way that Joan has done, you know, as cause and consequence of gender inequality. All of this is, you know, tremendous work that's been done by, I have to say, feminists around the world. Around the world, this is not, you know, the product of sort of women in the West, but it does raise profound questions of how far can we get with the law unless there are political movements that can stop that kind of abuse of the power that the law has as well. I mean, it also raises questions for me, Afsana's case about the rise of fundamentalism. You know, it's interesting that a judge in this case, purely for economic reasons, no doubt, you know, is more willing to side with the Dubai Sharia courts than with the French courts who are trying to interpret the law in a way that's conducive to the public good, that's conducive to women's rights. And that, you know, at the same time, the government here and the institutions here have gotten into bed with fundamentalists, have actually tried to promote Sharia in this country when they know the reality of Sharia for, you know, millions of women around the world. And Afsana is obviously an example of what, you know, so-called Sharia laws, religious laws, do for women. They take us back. They take away the gains that we have made, and they reinvigorate. They are reinvigorating patriarchy and radiating a kind of new forms of violence against women. So it raises those kind of questions about, you know, the need to take religious fundamentalism seriously, because it doesn't just work through acts of terrorism, violence. It also works through ideology. It also infiltrates in the very institutions in which we as feminists need, you know, to challenge some of the misogyny, to challenge some of the inequalities, to challenge the patriarchy, you know, the education, law, education, the criminal justice system, civil justice system. These are all sites of struggle for us. And when fundamentalists infiltrate those sites, we get what we got in Birmingham, which is protests outside schools for teaching sex education, for teaching relationship education. You know, we get the state supporting alternative systems of arbitration in this country, Sharia courts in this country that are profoundly discriminatory and misogynistic. And that's also because we are also located within a neoliberal capitalist framework, which wants to see all these things outsourced, wants to see justice outsourced, you know, to these places because it's too costly for the state to institute and deliver justice. And so, you know, and the last thing I want to say, and Afsana didn't even touch on this, is when women are failed by all these institutions, where do we go? We go to the media. We go en masse because we hope that by talking about our experiences, we might be able to amplify voices like that of Afsana and many, many other women. And Afsana tried to do that when she returned to the UK, and she went to the media, you know, mobilizing around her campaign to bring Louis home. What happened was that her perpetrator, her abuser, her ex, brought defamation case against the newspapers, which is now winding its way to the Supreme Court. And the whole way in which defamation laws, injunctions, emergency injunctions, non-disclosure agreements, they've all been used against women to gag us, to silence us. And the irony is that, you know, it's because the law has failed, women have gone to the media, like the Me Too movement. And when they go to the media and tell their story, then the law works to shut them down. So the media becomes a no-go space for women. And we've seen the way that's played out in many women's cases who have, you know, come forward to report sexual violence and abuse. And the enormity of what lies in front of us. I'm sorry I've taken up time, but I kind of feel that the Afsana's case touches on all these issues, and it just highlights the enormity.
There's so many places to go after this conversation. You know, patriarchy and state complicity. We talked about the media as a site of redress, but we also know that the media is a horrific site of discrimination and misogyny, and absolutely crap reporting on men's violence against women. But when we were talking about fundamentalism and terrorism, I thought it was a good time to look at Joan's book, because some people might not immediately put together the links between terrorism and misogyny and violence against women. So it'd be good, Joan, if you could explain what you found and, you know, summarize that excellent book.
Thank you. Can I just say first, I mean, how difficult it was to listen to Afsana's experience, and I think she, oh, have I frozen?
We can still hear you, Joan.
You can, yeah, okay, everything disappeared for a second. No, I mean, it was very hard to listen to Afsana's experience, and I quite understand how wretched she must feel. One of the things I do, chairing the Violence Against Women and Girls Board, is sit in an awful lot of meetings at City Hall. And I was in a meeting, I think towards the end of 2017, people were talking about terrorism, and they were, I was there to talk about domestic violence and rape, but so I listened to, it was mainly men, of course. I listened to them, and so eventually I put my hand up and I said, have you noticed that all the men you're talking about are domestic abusers, and that this violence doesn't come out of nowhere? It's not something that, you know, you haven't got these perfectly nice ordinary men who are incredibly nice to their families and look after their animals and so on, and then one day they wake up and they go out and they drive a van into a crowd, or they set off a bomb. There's usually a history of violence, and the violence is in the family. And everybody looked at me aghast. And the deputy commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was there. He went back to the yard and said, is this true? What data do we have? Because there is a national database of dead and convicted terrorists, and there's about 500 people on it, probably more by now, which Scotland Yard actually maintain. And he said, what data do we have on the family backgrounds and any previous domestic violence of these men? And the answer, he was told they didn't have any. Now, I don't think that's true. I think they do have got, because they've never linked the two things. So I began looking at, you know, for example, the 2017 attacks. So there was the Westminster Bridge attack, the London Bridge attack, the Finsbury Park attack, which was a right-wing one, and of course the terrible Manchester bombing. And all of the men involved in those attacks had a history of abusing women, whether it was sisters, girlfriends, wives, whatever. And none of this had really been picked up. So I thought, well, if this isn't actually being looked at, I'll go away and look at it. And I sort of landed myself with the awful task of looking at the backgrounds of around 50 very violent men, most of whom had killed quite a lot of people. And I found the same pattern over and over again, that these men are incredibly misogynist. And I think they become desensitized to the effects of violence. And they're probably quite excited by the effects of violence as well, because they see it all the time in the home. And they project all these feelings onto women. And one of the things I discovered when I was working on the book is just how many of these men actually go out and commit public acts of violence after their relationships break down. That was true of the Westminster Bridge attacker. He'd been married twice and he had another partner, and he'd been abusive to all of them. And this history, so I think there is a pattern with some of these men where it's such a narcissistic wound when they're finally thrown out of the home where they've been abusing women, that they go out and they take it out on the wider public. So what I was trying to do was to say there are warning signs, but they're being missed. And the reason they're being missed is what I came to realize is that virtually everybody who works on terrorism is male, both, you know, in terms of academics and in terms of MI5 and counter-terrorist police. And they don't think of it as male violence. That's the extraordinary thing. They think terrorism is over there and it's political violence. And then there's all this other violence, which is, you know, rape and domestic violence. And they don't see the two things being connected. So what I was trying to do was bring them together. And it's been extraordinary. The book came out in May last year, so it's about 18 months. It's been the response has been extraordinary, because the man who runs the Centre for the Study of Terrorism, Political Violence at St Andrews University, which is the oldest academic institution in Europe for the study of terrorism. I met him, and he said none of us had ever noticed this before, and he said our centre has never done a single piece of research on the sex/gender of terrorists, because everybody just assumes, well, they're men, but they don't ask themselves what that means. And they still don't see it as male violence. And I said, oh, tell me about your department. And he said, we have 11, you know, fantastic people working in our department. And then he looked at me and he said, and before you ask, they're all men. So there's now a huge amount of interest in actually bringing this context into the discussion. And I think it's incredibly important. The Manchester bomber, just to finish this off, Salman Abedi, that's an extraordinary case, because he was born in Manchester. His parents went back to Libya in 2011 to fight against Colonel Gaddafi. And he and his brothers were just left, and his sister were just left in Manchester. He got involved in low-level gang violence, things like that. But all what he did was, he was at a college in Manchester, South Manchester, and he developed a reputation for being a bully, for being very unpleasant to women teachers, you know, an obvious misogynist. But also going up and down to Libya and coming back and then spouting quite a lot of jihadist propaganda. And then one day, in front of an entire class, he punched a Muslim girl in the head for wearing a short skirt. And he went up to her and said, you can't wear that, you're a Muslim girl. And she told him where to go. So he punched her so hard in the head that she was almost knocked out. So what happens? So a 17-year-old boy showing signs of radicalization, misogynist attack in front of a lot of witnesses. So there's a very low threshold for violence here. So the Greater Manchester Police dealt with it through restorative justice. They sat him down with the victim, and he said how sorry he was, and he had anger management issues. They didn't take him to court. He wasn't charged. He didn't have a conviction. Whatever you think of Prevent, he is a prime candidate for Channel. No reference to Channel. So 2 years later, when he comes to the attention of MI5 for completely different reasons, because, you know, he's showing an interest in jihadist propaganda, etc., they say, does he have any criminal record? The answer is no. And twice he comes to their attention, and then finally, a few weeks before he carries out the bombing and kills 22 people, most of whom are women and girls, he starts visiting a convicted terrorist in prison, a category A prisoner, and they still don't put all that together. And that's a really shocking one to me. And it raises all kinds of questions about, you know, that parents who go off to a country where there's a horrible civil war going on, invite their children over. His brother, who's just been convicted and sent to prison for 45 or something like years, there are photographs of him as a teenager holding an AK-47 in Libya, and then these boys are going back to school in Manchester as though nothing's happened. It raises a huge number of questions, but at the heart of it for me is misogyny, and why we don't see misogyny as a warning signal of all kinds of things. So that's a sort of a detour into what I've been doing for a couple of years. And I just say to Afsana, I've been diagnosed with PTSD as well. And in my case, you know, it's obviously not things, I haven't been subjected to violence myself, but I've spent 30 years of my life being exposed to these stories and writing about male violence, and it does knock it out of you, I have to say.
Thank you, Joan. I think it's quite interesting putting together what we've been talking about the media, about education, about the court, and actually what we're talking about is patriarchy, isn't it? And how social institutions and communities and collective norms and values are complicit, really, in men's violence against women. And I just wondered whether any of you wanted to say anything more on the issue of patriarchy and complicity.
Could I say something else? It's just, I mean, I've been thinking while we've been talking about this, that this is about a legal system which is absolutely mired in patriarchy, whether it's the civil courts that Alan was talking about, or whether it's the criminal courts. So, you know, most of you will know the statistics. I don't need to tell you that 1.4% of rapes reported to the police actually ends in a prosecution. An even smaller percentage ends in a conviction. A couple of weeks ago, the National Police Chiefs Council announced that they were scrapping the Stafford Statement form, which rape victims are asked to fill in and provide access to their bank accounts and their school records and their employment records and their phone. And they're replacing it with a form. And I read the form, the new form is just as bad. You've probably seen it, Karen. Quite extraordinary. So it basically says, we'd like you to hand over your phone. You don't have to hand over your phone. If you don't, this will have consequences, including the fact that the case may not go ahead. And, or we may go to court, we may get an audit and make you give us your phone. But then it says, but if you don't give us your phone, we might have to go down other avenues to investigate the case. We might have to go and find CCTV film of the area you were in. Or we might have to look at the defendant's phone. So once again, we're in this situation where women are put in the situation where, you know, they have the burden of, if you don't give us everything we want, this man might not be prosecuted. So why are they not looking at the defendant's phone to see if he has violent pornography on it? Why are they not looking at the defendant's phone to see if he fantasizes with his friends about raping young women and so on? And so I actually, when I wrote Misogynies, I was young and I was quite optimistic. And I got something terribly wrong, because things are actually getting worse. And the criminal justice system is actually failing almost entirely to protect women and girls from violence. And it makes me so angry. We'll see how I get the moment I start talking about it. And I sit in rooms of what, you know, I have done for 30 years. I sit in rooms full of men talking about the criminal justice system and not understanding the biases that they bring into it. I mean, you must know this, Karen.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I saw Pragna was wanting to speak this. So I'm going to go over to Pragna.
Yeah, Karen, if you wanted to jump in, I'm happy to wait. No, I think that there is a danger in just constantly saying that, you know, it's just all patriarchal. It is, of course it is. But I think it really deserves to be unpicked. And to do that, we need to apply an intersectional lens, because patriarchy doesn't fall on everyone equally, you know. And there are other cross-cutting strands of discrimination that make and the social and political contexts in which things occur that can have disproportionate impact on some women and than others. So I think that really comes back to an earlier point or something I wanted to talk about, which was the need to constantly bring an intersectional lens to bear on everything that we discuss, including patriarchy. Because without that, we kind of miss not just, you know, we don't fail to answer the question of who's doing what to whom, but in what context. And I think that is really, really important. And I also feel that so if we're talking about patriarchy, then in the context of, say, terrorism, I think it's really important to look at how it's not so much just the terrorism that is perpetrated, but the ideology behind it that matters. So in the question of the terrorists who are linked to, you know, many of whom got sort of backgrounds of domestic abuse, I've seen that in our work, in some of the work that we've done trying to support women who are on the fringes of being caught up in radical, extremist activity, and or who've got children who are about to be caught up in extremist activity. And they come to us and they're seeking support from us. And when we talk to them, we find out that actually, you know, there is huge sort of really troubled backgrounds here, families that are dysfunctional, families where there's domestic abuse and so on and so forth, that's never been taken seriously. You're absolutely right, Joan. Nobody ever takes that domestic abuse seriously. And if they did, you know, maybe some of this could be prevented. But I do sort of also want to kind of slightly draw away from this idea of making the direct link between domestic terrorism and the kind of political terrorism that we are seeing, because of course not all terrorists come from backgrounds where they've faced domestic abuse, and so it doesn't explain the whole situation. And I fear what the state will do with this. I'm not somebody who thinks that there isn't a need for a de-radicalization program, for a way of intervening, early intervention, early safeguarding procedures that, if they were followed, would prevent people from committing the kind of acts of terrorism that they do, not just against women in the home, but also outside. But I also know that it's actually the fundamentalist ideology that needs to be tackled. It's the ideology that's kind of platform and gives the basis, the legitimacy for the terrorism that's committed. And the one thing that the state won't do is tackle that fundamentalist ideology. And why won't it do that? Because it's too busy jumping into bed with the very fundamentalists that it's supposed to be tackling. So, for example, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Hindu Council of Britain, these are all people who have enormous influence and who actually have a seat at the public table. And what do? They trade women's rights in return for a hands-off approach to religion and culture that they want to define, and that they want to sort of hands-off approach to the internal affairs of the community, so that they can set up their Sharia courts, so that they can set up separate faith schools, they can set up all the kind of structures that will subjugate women, that will, you know, treat women as second-class citizens, and will push women back into the domestic sphere. And that the need to address that fundamentalism and the fundamentalist ideology that lies behind terrorism is something that really has not been tackled, even amongst those who are involved in counterterrorism work. And, you know, one of the other things that we constantly said was, if the state funded properly organizations, Borg organizations, then that in itself would be a tremendous part of the actual work against terrorism, public political terrorism, because you're already, you know, intervening at a much earlier stage and you see the warning signs. And so I think that there's a kind of contradictory stuff going on here, and one has to be also very careful the way in which the state will co-opt violence against women into that whole securitization agenda. And that has to be, you know, that we have to think very carefully about how we do this work, how we look at the links between misogyny, patriarchy, violence against women, and extremism, and not just violent extremism, but extremism itself, without necessarily being co-opted by the state as well. So I think this is really, really, you know, there's some really, really, we need more discussions. We need more in-depth conversations. We need to look at this, because otherwise we see it all the time. We see it in the way in which issues around honor-based violence, issues of FGM, issues of forced marriage have been co-opted by the state to pursue a really inhumane, absolutely cruel and harsh immigration system and of control. And we're seeing the results of that, with so many migrant women being left out of protections, even as the domestic bill is proceeding through Parliament. And, you know, that's one of our campaigns, to get the state to understand that migrant women are deserving of protection equally along with other women. But the immigration agenda, the surveillance agenda takes over. And so I think these are really important discussions. We shouldn't shy away from any of this. And I'm the first one to be absolutely honest and lay bare our communities, warts and all. But I do think that there are all these kind of forces at play, and that we need to kind of navigate our way through all of it.
I think what you've been saying illustrates the complexity when we're looking at these issues, and the complexity really of ending men's violence against women and girls, and the approach that we'd need to take. And it struck me while you were speaking that something like CEDAW actually might be a tool to dealing with fundamentalism for the reasons that you've gone into. But we've got 10 minutes left now, and we haven't looked at a single question from the women who, I'm sure it is mainly women who are still with us here tonight. I'm looking.
So, Karen, can I just say one tiny thing?
Please,
which is just the comments are coming, and I haven't been able to answer it, but to everyone out there that's sending messages, the messages are popping up on my screen. Thank you so much. Thank you. One of the wonderful things about women and men as well who give support, let's not forget them, but I really, really appreciate it, all the messages. So it does give me strength. It is a difficult time, but thank you. I'm sorry I can't respond to everyone, but I just want to say I can see the messages coming in, so I really want to thank everyone for their lovely messages and kind words of support.
I am clicking this. Some of the questions that were on the question and answer panel have disappeared. I think we had about 6 at one point, another about 3, and it's difficult to fit them in really with the conversation that we've been having. So I am going to be a really bad chair and ignore them. I'm sorry. We've got 9 minutes left, and we've had a very heavy conversation. So could each panel member give me about 2 minutes, please, on is there any room for optimism?
Can I go first?
Yeah, please do.
So 2 minutes. So what I want to say,
you haven't spoken.
3. I just think it's important. I was listening to Joan and Pragna and yourself and all the things that you've been doing, and I think there is a common thing there. I mean, I'm a glass half empty person because my whole situation is like that. But I do want to say there is some optimism, because there's an issue about accountability. We have to hold the state, whether it's the police, the CPS, the media, the legal system, because if we don't stand up, we can't be silenced. So we have to be the ones to hold these individuals and state institutions to be accountable. And the other side of that, for everyone that's joining, I think when I look at the sheer numbers, the horrific numbers of violence against women, coercive control, I mean, you know, it's not just physical violence, psychological. We spoke about mental health. I haven't had a lot of chance to talk about it, but one thing that struck me, in the same way we're talking about terrorism and the links with domestic violence, the awful impact and effect on one's mental health, and children as well, and the children that are involved. You see families all the time, and there's the untold effect of that is never quantified. It's never taken into account. And so I think one of the things that I would say, if I was going to do a call for action, is we must together stand tall. We must hold the state and all its agencies to account. We must also strengthen civil society. So I know people have been supporting Centre for Women's Justice, Southall Black Sisters, NIA. We must support these organisations, because they're the ones that are doing the heavy lifting for those of us who can't. Journalists, I know the media get a bad ride. I'm not going to be negative about the media today, because if it wasn't for the media, I wouldn't be here today. So the media can be a powerful tool, but it also equally needs to be held into account as well, because some of the awful headlines and misogyny is fueled by, I would say, largely an ignorant media. And again, there aren't enough women, female journalists, for example, we know that. So I would just like to end on the positive message to say that actually, you know, speaking up, challenging, and talking about however painful it is for me, it does work. Because if you guys didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to not even raise the funding. I wouldn't be able to have a voice. And it's because you guys have done that as well, and everyone out there.
I'm going to jump over to Joan and ask Whether you can find any room for optimism, Joan?
Well, I've thought about this for a long time, and one of the things that amazed me is that this is not a political issue in the conventional sense. So, having spent many years, weeks of my life knocking on doors during election campaigns for the Labour Party, nobody has ever raised violence against women with me on the doorstep. Nobody has ever said it's a scandal that so few rape cases end in convictions, that women aren't supported. And I wonder, why is that? The kind of things that people raise all kinds of things on the doorstep, and yet somehow the criminal justice system, they might complain about local youths or something like that. They don't complain about violence against women. And is that because it's it's normalized? People just think it's something they've got to put up with, or is it not seen as important enough to be political in the same way that something like Brexit is? And so I just wonder if there's a way of actually breaking through that kind of silence around this as a political issue and saying this affects half the population. It's really, really important, and trying to make it something that MPs and political candidates actually have to take on board and answer.
Yeah. Alternatively, you might find the Labour Party banning women from joining in because they stand up for women's rights. Now, that, as you know, that's happened to me, and that that's not what I'm not going to take up time to discuss that now. So I'll move on to Pragna. Pragna, you still manage to be optimistic in it?
Yeah. We have to be optimistic, because if we're not optimistic, we can't sort of continue with hope, and there is hope. Despite all this, despite the challenges, despite the fact that it feels like we've gone backwards, I just think that there is so much to be optimistic about. I mean, the fact that there was a Me Too movement, the fact that there were women in their thousands coming out in Poland against attempts to roll back their reproductive rights, the fact that in India, after the Delhi rape case, there were women were coming out from all backgrounds, absolutely demanding accountability from the state. I just think around the world, the fact that, the US government has not yet been able to roll back Roe versus Wade, the fact that in Argentina, in Latin America, women have stood up and, and have influenced the way in which protests and resistance goes on around the world. I just think these are amazing moments, and they tell us there is power in women coming together, the strength of women, the ability of women to, resist anything and everything, and to be creative in the process. So I think we have to carry on. We have to use whatever space, cultural, political, sports, legal, educational, whatever space we have to continue raising our issues and to continue seeking accountability. But I think there is a growing consensus that this is not acceptable, that it is not acceptable in the 21st century to beat women, to rape women in the marriage and outside. But I think that because women have been so successful, because there is this consensus, we're facing such a backlash. So the backlash in a way, is in a paradoxical way, is part of our victory. It's our victory that's forcing people to find even more violent ways of trying to crack down on our bodies and our minds. And I actually think that, as long as we stand up and as long as we carry on and, have our discussions, our conversations, our differences, but come together as well, then I think that, we can give all these forces a run for their money.
Thank you. I think for me, as a feminist, you're often stuck, aren't you, between a revolutionary and a reformist, and we all want to be revolutionaries, but if we're not reformists, we leave behind a lot of women in the system that we've got, and there's the need to be both.
Yeah.
I just want to end tonight before I thank you all and thank everybody for sticking with us. I came across a quote, an Angela Davis quote today, which I think sums up the last five minutes that we've had. And she said, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I think that symbolizes what we've talked about in the last 10 minutes, and I guess our life's work in men's violence against women. So thank you all very much for being part of this panel. You've been incredible tonight, and for me it's been a pleasure to listen to you. I hope it's been interesting for people that are listening.